At the back end of the 1990s, the height of the dot-com boom, Jerry Colonna was a high-profile venture capitalist in New York City. On the surface, he was a great success, but by the early 2000s, he started struggling, not just with his day job, but with life in general. And that was the catalyst for a major journey of transformation. And today, Jerry is a high-profile executive coach and co-founder of a leadership and development firm in the US. When I read Jerry's book, Reboot, it really grabbed me. This idea that in order to reboot our professional lives, all we need to do is to reconnect with our deepest selves, to unearth who we really are. And when I read that, I thought, I've got to meet this guy. Well, today, Jerry's in London. So let's go and have a chat with Jerry Colonna. I discovered Jerry and his work earlier this year. And it was all around the book, which we're going to talk about tonight, called Reboot. Because this book kept on showing up in my social media. I saw it on Instagram and I saw it on Twitter. I saw people talking about it. And I must admit that when I first saw people talking about it, I went, yeah, fair enough, but that's not for me. Mm-hmm. No offense, Jerry. Mm. And then it persisted in showing up. And I thought, you know what, maybe I'm meant to read this book. Maybe I'm meant to see this book. Mm. And I ordered it in October and I read it. And you know, it really spoke to me. And I think, you know, I love a good story, and if you don't know the full Jerry story, we'll hear it later, but you know, Jerry's story from, well, a little over 20 years ago now, from back at Flatiron Partners as a venture capitalist, the height of the dot-com boom, to your journey today as an executive coach and all the work you do with Reboot, you know, is a really interesting trajectory. And I should also say that there was something in Jerry's story that spoke to me in my story. We had shared a cup of tea. We didn't share a cup of tea. We had one each. We shared a cup of tea this afternoon, talking about how when I read Jerry's book and I understood some of Jerry's story, how that made me feel, because I could identify with some of the things in my own story. For those of you in the room that know me well, my own story of transformation, my own story of struggle, and my own story of kind of finding myself. And I think when I read this book, I thought, you know, it spoke to me even more deeply. And I must admit, in 2019, I don't often write a letter to someone I don't know. But after reading Jerry's book, I found his office address, his HQ in Boulder, Colorado, and I wrote a letter. And that was only 2 months ago, probably less than 2 months ago. And what the lovely thing is, that letter kind of started off a relationship. And what I love about the world which we live now, started a relationship which has led to us being here this evening. So let's give a warm round of applause, Mr. Jerry Colonna.
I'm an American, I'm a hugger. Thank you, Ian. I'm going to try to find a spot for this. That sound good, Dan? It was, your letter was really moving. And, hi. There's a seat right there. That's good. And in part because I could feel the kinship, which was really confirmed this afternoon when we got to talking. So before I begin, how many people have read the book? Great. So you all have, there we go. Did you finish? I know you were, no.
I have finished it.
All right. I expect questions. So the book is a little different. It's a little different from the standard leadership fare. Would you say that's true?
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's got a fairly revealing memoir style to it. And I do tell stories from my clients' lives. Most of those stories are composite stories. A few are named individuals with their permission. And the reason that is so is that really I speak to it early on, and this is why I like to give a little context to the book before I get started. I tell this story in the introduction the publisher contacted me and said, we'd really love to have you write a book. And they were pretty persistent, which is, if anybody's tried to shop a book, that's kind of extraordinary, right? And the reason is because there was this Wired article that had come out about me that the headline of which was, "This man makes founders cry." So everybody just in the front, just their heart just stopped. So, and the task that I was sort of given was, what is it that I believe to be true about leadership? And what I believe to be true about leadership can be summed up in a very simple phrase: better humans make better leaders. Now that sounds profound, and it's actually quite simple and kind of obvious. And yet, it's obvious notwithstanding, we're still left with the fact that we have shitty leadership all over the place. I should note that I'm from Brooklyn and I tend to curse, and if you don't like it, fuck you. And so then the question, that then begs the question, was, why do we have such difficult leadership? Why do we create toxic environments, not just in our workplace, but in our societies? Why is it that people who have power seem unable to create environments that feel safe, where the whole human being can show up? And this simple answer that I came to, which is actually quite complicated, is that we're all stuck. Oftentimes we're stuck in this process of what I refer to as just simply growing up. That the process of becoming an adult is really challenging. And that we're often held back by belief systems that really date back to our childhood. Belief systems that were designed to keep us feeling loved, feeling safe, as best as we could, and that we belong. Despite the violence that we may have grown up with, implicit or explicit, those belief systems carry over into our chronological adulthood and then start to affect our lives. So the book is really an exploration of this question. Why is it so difficult for us to lead well? Or more specifically, why is it so difficult for us to grow up and really confront the issues that we have? You see why I start to make people cry? They start to remember. Right. And so just notice what's happening to you right now, because you're dropping back in. And that's really the point. So often the clients that come in and they want to understand how to do their jobs. How do I fire people? How do I hire people? How do I experience less burnout? How do I feel less stress? How do I go home and not take it out on my kids? And I annoy the crap out of them. Because I say things like, tell me about your father. Tell me about your mother. Tell me what money felt like when you were a child. And I can almost always tell you about the life choices that you've made.
As Jerry said at the beginning, I've read a lot of leadership books, and I've never read one quite like that. And I think I've never found those kind of revelations inside a leadership book. So one thing I'm curious about, Jerry, is, I started my career, I'm a couple of years younger than you. I started my career at the beginning of the 1990s, where the world of work felt very different to it does now. I'm just wondering what your take is on the world of work now, and how ready organizations are for this kind of language and this kind of approach. Because, it feels like a lot of organizations are much more open, and leaders are much more open to talk about what we call, emotional intelligence, all this kind of stuff, which certainly weren't 25 years ago when I started my career, longer. And is that a good thing, that people are seemingly more open to talking about vulnerability, talking about story, talking about struggle, all these things that were taboos a while ago? I'm not saying they're not taboos anymore in 2019, but it feels there's been a bit of a shift. What do you feel about that?
Well, the first thing I would say is, the first thing I would do is comment upon the first assertion, which is that there's been a movement. And I suppose when you step back far enough and you see the arc, there is a movement. It's kind of like the curvature of the planet. But you actually have to step back far enough, because emotional intelligence, which is the term coined by Daniel Goleman, the Buddhist psychologist, I think he wrote that seminal article in Harvard Business Review 30 years ago. People have been talking about this for decades. We still struggle to hear it. Now that said, I do think that there is something afoot here. Sometimes it takes a brave soul to stand up and say, hey, I struggled. And you know, when a white cisgendered male stands up in front of a room and says, I struggled, shit happens for the good. And there is more of that happening. It's not a lot, but there's more of it happening. The other thing that I think may be going on, I'll tell another story. About a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I was on CNN on a documentary on mental health in Silicon Valley. And at one point I'd been working with a reporter for months, and at one point in the 2-hour interview, which got cropped down to like 8 minutes, the reporter asked me a question, and I, of course, being a coach, asked her a question in response, right? It's a good therapist trick, right? Especially if you don't know the answer. You just ask another question. And what I was asking was, why are you doing this story? And she gave me an answer, and it was kind of a fluffy answer, and I just said, yeah, that's bullshit. And I said, tell me the real reason why you're doing this story. And she began to explain to me that her aunt, whom she had always admired, had had a mental breakdown in her 50s. And she'd lost this role model. And she wanted to understand mental illness. And I looked at her and I said, thank you, that's actually a real answer. Now we can actually have a real conversation. Because when the media doesn't actually show up authentically, they just propagate falsehoods and create this disconnect. Anyway, thankfully, Lori left that in. And the producers at CNN left that in. And a few weeks later, I got a phone call from a global head of talent development at a 15,000 person software company, who called up and said, that moment, we need you to come in and talk to the CEO in front of the whole company and call them on their bullshit. And I said, well, all right, tell me a little bit more what's going on. And she made the point that healthcare claims for depression and anxiety among the children of the most senior leaders had been up 50, 60, 70% in the previous 2 years. The children who don't get a paycheck, who don't have a choice. Now, when we were children, our parents sublimated and suppressed that struggle, probably by drinking, sometimes by hitting, oftentimes by fighting. And we pay the price. And the question is, what do we who have power and agency, because that's what adulthood is, what do we do with that? Do we bring it forward? Or do we say, right here, right now, it ends? Because they only did the best they could because that's what they grew up with. And grandma and grandpa, they only did the best that they could because that's what they grew up with. And so on, and so on, and so on. So if there is an arc that's bending, I think it's bending towards acknowledging that there are implications. And to me, the workplace is a great place to do this work because we all have to pay bills. And corporations aren't going away. And we spend 10, 12 hours a day in that relationship. So let's use workplace to grow up. Long-winded answer to a
No, I like
complicated
it. It's a good
question.
answer. Thank you. So I guess the heart of the book and the opportunity for us all and everyone that's going to read it is this idea that we can all reboot our professional lives by reconnecting with our deepest selves. And a phrase that I wasn't familiar with before reading this and listening to some podcasts is this whole kind of notion of what Jerry calls radical self-inquiry.
That's trademarked. You have to pay me 2 cents now.
Got it.
Just kidding.
This whole thing of radical self-inquiry, you know, and I love the concept of that. But can you just kind of unpack that for us? Because
Sure.
It sounds great, but like, how can each of us attempt that? You know, if we're not going on a Reboot boot camp, or we're not engaging Jerry Colonna as a coach,
or buying 10 copies of the book that you've now gotten for free.
Yeah, how do we start that?
So let me unpack it a little bit. What do I mean by that? It actually, the phrase came to me by way of one of my Buddhist teachers, Anipema Chodron, who, her most famous book is When Things Fall Apart. I don't know if anybody's read that book, but I highly recommend it. And it's this, the Buddhist notion is that a large part of our suffering stems from the ways in which we delude ourselves, the ways in which we hide honest truth from ourself, and then we all collectively sort of disengage. And the way I define it is it's the process by which the masks that we wear are skillfully, and this is really important, compassionately stripped away so that we kind of have no place left to hide. What makes it radical is that we tend not to do this. There's a joke I often do when I do talks, and I open up and I'll say, how are you? No, really. Don't bullshit me. How are you really feeling? Because more often than not, it's very complex. A little up, a little down, a little sad, a little scared, a little tired, a little exhausted, a little like, what, right? And what do we more often than not say? I'm fine, how are you? And immediately we have an agreement to not tell the truth. And then they'll call in a coach and they'll say, we have a trust problem in the organization. Because everybody's walking around lying. Not maliciously, but not really showing up. And so that first process of acknowledging where are you in your life. See, when it doesn't get acknowledged, Ian, what tends to happen is we then start to act out. We pull the ripcord or self-sabotage our career. We make sure that the thing that we need to have happen, which is a change, happens outside of our control. Just the way teenagers will do. Whereas an adult says, this is not working for me. And I am scared. And I might even feel ashamed. And I know I'm going to hurt someone. But I need to take this step anyway. Because any other choice is too deadly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can we just rewind? I mean, we met Jerry, the young boy, and we met Jerry, the father of with the shoes. Can we just rewind to 1996 when you founded Flatiron Partners with Fred Wilson? And I'm just curious about the trajectory that you've kind of gone on, that your life has taken. And I'm just curious about everything you learned back then as a venture capitalist, which must be so valuable and critical to the journey you're on now, how you work with leaders, because you were on the board of these businesses that you were investing in. You know, you were this high-flying firm. And I'm just wondering, and I know that kind of the way that story ended was, you started loving it and then you struggled. But I'm not so much focusing on that right now. Just about what you might have learned then that's so helpful now in terms of how you work with leaders.
Yeah, and so I'll just say a word about the break. I left when I was 38, the venture business, because I had no choice. I would have, the depression was so bad that I literally it felt like a life or death choice. And the result is the man I am today. But it wasn't clear that it was going to be that path. To your question, what did I learn that is applicable here? Well, today, and you probably get this with your clients, today, what happens oftentimes is that a leader will sit down and work with a coach, and as I was describing at the top, they'll come in with a sort of bunch of hows, but within a few minutes, if you're working with a good coach, what ends up starts being revealed is the struggle. And folks often exacerbate the pain of that struggle by being convinced that they're the only one feeling that. That they're the only one who doesn't have a clue how to do the job. Or that they're the only one who feels like they're faking it every day. And one of the benefits of having served on 160 boards of directors,
Wow, that's a lot.
that's a lot, is everybody's faking it. Okay? There's not a single, for example, here's a simple example. There's not a single company I ever invested in when I was a professional investor that actually executed everything in their business plan. And yet, the investors will tell you that they're investing based on the business plan. Talk about collective delusion. Right? Now, if all of those companies, none of those companies are actually executing against the business plan, and we're all like looking at the business plan saying, give us the answer, we're all bullshitting. What if we took a step back and said, okay, there's something powerful that this collective is coming up with, and there are these ideas, but it's in fact changing. It's almost organic, and it's growing every day, and it's, quote, pivoting, to use a popular technology industry term. And let's accept that, and the uncertainty, and therefore the fear that comes from that. And let's ride that.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to ask one more question now, and then, so I'd like to throw it open in a second. So, or not a second, a couple of minutes. So please have a question ready. I'd love to hear from what's on your mind. But one thing I just want to talk about, which is kind of quite personal to me, was something that I took from the book, and I like Twitter, and it's always interesting to see what I kind of tweet out as the tweetable takeaway, But I mean that in a good way, because it was kind of like what I took from it. It was, as someone who's had a career as an independent for 20 years, kind of making it as I go along with no great plan, and lovely to hear what you just said about, no one ever executes on the business plan, is that one thing I like in the book, this theme, is that it's okay to not know exactly where we're heading. You said, what if we felt differently about when we feel lost in our career or business lives? And you said, what if being lost was an indicator of growth? What if being lost is part of the path? So I love that, because it kind of helped me feel a bit better about my journey and my path, kind of what I kind of called unplanning.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about what your theory on that is, and how being lost can be can be an indicator for growth? Yeah.
And I'll warn you, my children are used to me talking about them at this point, so they're, but this notion really hit me. My oldest son is Sam, and he's 29. Anybody have children in their 20s? You know how lost they feel? Right, in a way that I didn't feel that way. But the 20s seem harder now than ever before. And I think that we, the elders in the room, have kind of left them with a mistaken impression, which is that you graduate university and you know exactly what you're going to do and you just go execute it. And if you don't, there's something wrong with you. And in fact, I think that belief system starts at the earliest grades. And the belief system carries over into leadership development because the belief system is that, as I often say, that there's some place in the magic quadrant up and to the right where some magic soul has it all figured out and doesn't feel any anxiety or any fear or any doubt. And that's also nonsense. In fact, I know no one successful, however you want to measure their life, who goes from point A to point B directly. And yet, along the way, anything along the way, we use words like lost, confused. And the truth is, that is the path. That is the way. How can you be lost if you're actually on the path? Oh, you feel lost because you don't know where you're going, and therefore you're afraid you're going to end up in the wrong place. David Wagner has a beautiful poem called Lost, the first line of which is, when you find yourself lost in the woods, stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. Because to the tree, there is no lost. You're just here, right here. You're just not, oh, you're not where you thought you were going to be. Oh, okay. So much for those plans. If we could hold that, we might actually give ourselves a little bit of a break. Instead of questioning, am I on the path? Say, have I been kind today? And if I have not been kind today, can I be kind tomorrow? That feels like a much easier way to live. It's scary. But, you know, as I also describe in Buddhism, we talk about the pathless path. And the hard part of that is like, fuck, I have to figure it out myself. Any high achievers in the room with good grades? You all hate the pathless path. Because you just want to know the path to the best grade in the room.
Well, I love that. That gives me some language to use about my own story.
When I talk about not boarding the roller coaster, and I don't make it clear in that section, so in the second edition I'll clarify. What I'm talking about is when we tie our sense of self-worth and self-esteem to an accomplishment of a goal, and then the path on that goal feels like a roller coaster, then in my parlance, in my metaphor, we're riding the roller coaster. And so the point of not boarding the roller coaster, it simply is a way of thinking about not tying your sense of self-esteem and self-worth to your job, to your company, to your endeavor. Now that's really hard because we often use passion to compel ourselves to do something. And this is for me, this is a simple to understand concept from years of trying to internalize it from Buddhism. It's the notion of non-attachment versus attachment versus detachment, right? So detachment is, I'm never going to start another company again. Or I'm going to quit this job and I'm never going to do this again. And attachment is, if I leave my job as an attorney, as a barrister, is that what we would say? Mm-hmm. Then I'm somehow worthless. Forget about fears about money. That's attachment. But non-attachment is more of that equanimity state, which is, I might stay, I might not. but I'm going to be okay regardless. Even if everybody else around me thinks less of me. Ooh, that's the hard one. So that's what I really meant by not boarding the roller coaster in the first place. You, those struggles you bring, don't bring those to the workplace. Why? Or more specifically, grammatically correct, why not? Or I'll give you even more. We bring it in anyway. We just pretend we don't. And then we have trust issues in the organization. There's a scene in the book in which I speak to this. My youngest son, Michael, and I go to a movie, which is a thing we do. He was 13 at the time. He's 22 now. And the movie has a plot twist at the end that caused me to go back in time and remember something from my childhood. And it was deadly. It was really difficult. And I burst into tears. And I was sitting there crying and crying and crying. And then the movie ends and the credits roll, and I'm still sitting there glued to my chair crying, 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 crying. And then the lights come up and I'm still sitting there crying, crying, crying. Now picture this. I have a 13-year-old son sitting next to me going, what the hell do I do? People are leaving the room. Finally, I get it together and I can go out to the parking lot, and I'm sitting in the car and I'm still crying. I'm trying to drive. And he says, Dad, what is it? What is it? I'm like, no, I can't. And he says, Dad, you might as well tell me what's going on, because if not, I'm going to make shit up and it's going to be negative about me. Okay? I always think of that when I hear the yeah, but question. And you're right. I know you're dealing with, I know you know the truth of what I'm saying, and I know you're speaking on behalf of your clients in effect. Yeah, Eleanor, that's fine. It's well and good for me to bring that here. But when I go to the workplace, I have to be that authoritarian leader. Because when I was 5, if I wasn't that, my father would beat the crap out of me. We got to toughen you up. We got to toughen you up. Corollary note, my teacher and friend Parker Palmer says, violence is what we do when we don't know what to do with our suffering. And when we teach, mostly boys, when we do not teach them what to do with suffering, is it any wonder that they turn to authoritarian violence as the answer? Of course not, it's totally logical. They're being safe. They're just playing out the lessons that they learned when they were 5. And they learned them well. Now, let's talk about productivity in the workplace. Imagine you're having a planning meeting with your senior executives, and one person's going through a divorce. And to cover the pain, they're drinking a little bit more. How productive are they? All right, so what should we do? Should we fire them? They've worked there for 20 years. They have an incredible... So what should we do? Shut it down, leave it at the work, blah, blah, blah. So then they go home and they drink more. And then they get a chance to have an argument with their children. And then the child rings up a therapist. But imagine a different kind of workspace. Imagine we walk in and we say, Tom, I see you had a hard weekend. Are you doing okay? Really hard weekend. But I'm here. I'm thankful that I have this work because it really keeps me distracted. But thanks for asking. That's it. I'm not talking about turning the planning session into a therapy session. Don't worry. I'm just talking about acknowledging that there's a human heart there that's hurting. And 2 hours later, when Tom has to make a choice about whether or not he's going to give an extra ounce of energy, what's he going to choose? Well, Jerry heard me. So I'll roll up my sleeves and I'll do my best because I am appreciated. I'm not talking about massive dramatic shifts in the workplace. I'm just talking about human beings being treated like human beings. I grew up with a tremendous amount of food insecurity and violence and poverty. And when I was a venture capitalist, when I was an investor, I drove myself. You listen to the Alex Blumberg podcast. I drove myself in ways that were deeply unhealthy. But it wasn't consciously a pursuit of money. It was a pursuit of what I carried from childhood, which was lemon drops, little candies. And the lemon drop story is that when I was a boy, the place of safety was my grandparents' house. And my grandfather, who always seemed to have money, even though he didn't have more than a 6th grade education, always had this endless supply of lemon drops. And so for me, money and lemon drops became sort of conflated, and it became about feeling safe. And the seminal moment for me was when my then therapist said to me, "How much will it take for you to feel safe?" And when I found myself saying Bill Gates, I knew I had a problem. Because, and the context of that conversation was physical problems that I was having, somaticized problems, endless migraines, overweight, really unhealthy, and really just terribly unhappy at the height of the world's approbations for me, the world calling me. New York Magazine called my partner Fred and I princes of New York. You know, for a kid from Brooklyn, that was a big deal. And the more approbation I had, the less secure I felt. And so that needed to be rewired. I still like money, but I am not attached to it. I mean, I drive a fast car, you know, I like things. But it's not the same anymore. The woman who taught me that first question was Dr. Sayers, my psychoanalyst, with whom I worked for almost 30 years. She passed 2 years ago at the age of 93. And she was and remains my greatest teacher, by far and away. She's here. And she asked me that question one day when I was struggling with migraines again, and I grew up with migraines. And her question was, after the neurologist had determined that there was nothing biologically wrong with my brain, I was just having these migraines, she said to me, really in exasperation, "What are you not saying that you need to say, Jerry?" Because she's from Brooklyn. She was tough. And it was later that I added the additional questions of, what am I saying that's not being heard? And as a boy, I often said things that were not heard. And then later, as a leader, I would often say things that are not being heard. But most importantly, what's being said that I'm not listening to and not hearing? Because people are trying to get through to me all the time. And I'm not paying attention to that.
I've thought about it a lot though. If you had a hierarchy or you weighted them, and which would have more importance, but actually all three of them equally are so important. And I think the middle one, what's being said that's not being heard, is probably for the individual the most soul destroying.
Yeah, that you just
Maybe.
said. You just said it incredibly well.
Because you're aware and you want to say and trying to get it out, but no one's listening or hearing. It's very conscious, whereas the first one is perhaps.
And you may not be using words to speak, but you're still speaking. And you're not being heard. And soul destroying is a really, really apt description. Think of a child. Those who don't have power in a particular situation. Saying, I matter, I am here. Do you remember the other question she taught me?
No, the only three that I really remember.
How have I been complicit in creating the conditions I say I don't want?
Yeah.
How have I been accomplice driving the getaway car, not responsible? How have I been complicit in creating the conditions I say I don't want?
Yeah, 100%.
That, if you want to understand psychoanalysis, that question.
Well, look, thank you so much. I think,
Thank you.
I think you know what I love about this. How we're here this evening is that I read a book, and I wrote a letter, and I mailed it off to Boulder, Colorado, and fucking hell, here we are.
And
at the
fucking
H Club on
hell.
a Monday night. Wouldn't it be great if that always worked like that? So thank you for saying
get up
yes.
here. I'm getting a hug again.